All right, ladies and gentlemen, now let's begin looking at some of the long-term and short-term causes of the French Revolution. This is the second lecture in our series, and we'll just jump right into it with some of the long-term causes of the political and economic troubles in France. Some long-term causes come into a few different categories. One, the influence of the American Revolution should not be downplayed. Remember, France participated in the American Revolution. They sent troops, they sent money. They were interested in American concepts of liberty. Um, from the monarchy's standpoint, which was not as interested in liberty, was certainly interested in revenge against the British for the defeats of France during the Seven Years' War. But unfortunately, France did not come out of it very well. It mostly just incurred a lot of debt by supporting the American cause, and that only compounded its financial woes. Another aspect of the long-term causes of the French Revolution were the Enlightenment critiques of French government. On one hand, we have the political theories of John Locke, the idea that government is there to protect certain rights of individuals, and like many social contract theorists, that governments are put in place because they possess in some way the consent of the governed. We find that in Locke. We find that in others. In Rousseau, again, another social contract theorist, consent of the governed, the will of the people, the general will that we find in Rousseau. Montesquieu's very aristocratic take on government, that government should be divided, that government should not be absolute, that there should be separations of powers. In Montesquieu's theory, of course, it should be that the king should share power with his nobility. But again, remember, that's sort of modeled in a way on the English parliamentary system at a time when the English Parliament was essentially dominated by the English aristocracy. The House of Lords was the primary theater of government during that time, and or lords were ones who were elected to be prime ministers, or who were chosen to be prime ministers to corral a majority within the House of Commons. So Montesquieu, even looking to the English model, could see how that balance between aristocracy and nobility was a positive development. The economic liberty theorists of the Enlightenment, the physiocrats, who had some commonality with the capitalist theories of Adam Smith. They actually begin to develop the laws of things like supply and demand, market forces, and so forth. But the physiocrats, tended to be more agricultural. They tended not to see the same kind of economic principles at work in what they call the sterile class, which was the manufacturing sector. They didn't see that as being as productive as agriculture, and so land for them was primary. Adam Smith, of course, is going to look at the nature of capital and how that works in a proto-industrial economy, and so therefore it's going to be he's really going to make the grand statement of economic liberalism of the time, the law of supply and demand, and the fact that government should basically stay out of economy and allow economic forces to take their own turn. And then, of course, the criticism that also came out of the Enlightenment of the efficiency of government, taxes. Right? Everybody's critical of taxation policies, especially when the taxes are falling largely on the third estate, but the first two estates, 5% of the population control 50% of the land. They're not paying any tax. There is an inequity in that. And laws. Laws in France were still very traditional. They had evolved out of the Middle Ages. They were inconsistent throughout France. There was lots of traditions bound up in the way in which laws were organized. That was also engendered the ire of many Enlightenment philosophers. And that the estate system, as I mentioned a moment ago, the estates, the idea that there's the clergy, the aristocracy, and then this 95% of the people fall in the third estate, this failed to recognize the emerging realities of French society. The bourgeoisie, this wealthy, middle class, well educated, was not really well represented, or at least on paper, it appeared that the bourgeoisie had very little support outside of the third estate itself. In reality, however, when the Estates General begins to meet again, we will actually see that the bourgeoisie will have a little bit more support from the other estates than they might have hitherto expected. There are some historical interpretations that we have to sort through a little bit here. There's the traditional view that the bourgeoisie was united in economic and political opposition to the regime, and that the bourgeoisie led the third estate to challenge the tax policies of the government. This is the traditional view that many historians have made textbooks will reiterate over and over and over again. More recent historians have reevaluated the nature of the third estate, and they've seen far more rivalries within the third estate than they once thought. Various competing interests. And when we look at the cahier de doléances, the list of grievances, we'll see that there are specific grievances that emerge out of the bourgeoisie, and then among the rural peasantry, they have a different set of concerns about actually retaining their feudal privileges, actually, which many in the middle class would have wanted to do away with all feudal privileges. Many who were more allied with the peasantry wanted to keep them. Many peasants were very concerned about the local church and the parish being well staffed, and money from the contributions going to the tithe actually going back into the local parish. Some of those aren't really concerns of the bourgeoisie, the urban dwelling middle class. Additionally, many members of the bourgeoisie actually wanted to form links with the nobility because the middle class saw their wealth and their power and their education, or their ability to project power, was linked with joining the ranks of the nobility, so they did not want to entirely alienate the nobles, especially the lesser nobles, because convenient marriage alliances could be established there, and then the bourgeoisie could rise up into the second estate. Okay? And many nobles shared the liberal ideals of the middle class. Baron de Montesquieu, who articulates the division of power, was very much one who was seen as more on the liberal side of the political spectrum in the pre-revolutionary period. As well, many of the nobles saw that their way to kind of extort changes out of the monarchy meant that the nobles needed to make common cause with the members of the middle class. They were just as displeased with the absolutist tendencies of the French state as many of the members of the middle class were. Now let's turn our attention to some more immediate causes. First and foremost is the debt crisis. By the 1780s, nearly half of French revenue went to debt service. Now, what precisely does that mean? It means that the debt of France was generating such a huge interest payment that to pay the interest on the debt consumed half of the revenue, tax revenue, of the French state. Okay? So, in effect, the French government could pay half of its tax income every year and never actually pay down their debt. They would only actually pay the interest on it. Now, that's pretty impressive. If you think, let's say, that the median income in the United States around now is somewhere, that varies a lot, but one recent statistic I saw, household income was about $55,000 a year, is kind of middle class. Let's even say that's after taxes, which is high, but that would mean that about $25,000 a year would go to pay the interest on credit cards, or the interest on credit cards and mortgage payments. And that would only leave $25,000 a year, or $30,000 a year or so, for to pay everything else. And that's only your interest payment. So that must mean that there would be a debt that household incurred somewhere in the neighborhood of a credit card debt of over $100,000 in credit card debt. Okay, and just paying the interest payments on that consumes half of the household income. That's how we have to kind of think about this. This is a huge sum of money for a single household or a single nation to incur. However, it's not quite as bad as the British or the Dutch debt at the same time, because they were effectively the winners in the 7 Years' War, and they had to outspend the French. It's one of the reasons why the British enacted a tax policy in North America that got them into trouble with the colonists and precipitated the American Revolution. Okay? One of the things that could not happen, the government could not declare bankruptcy again. If the French government declared bankruptcy, as it had several times over the course of the 18th century, confidence in the French economy and the French currency would be absolutely shaken, and as a result of that, no one would ever want to loan the French government any money, and the French would not be able to meet its expenditures. And to keep on a kind of constant arms race, competitive footing with the British. And so bankruptcy was not an option. The French budget would collapse if they had declared bankruptcy. There's no central government, so no paper currency can be floated, no credit can be generated. At low interest payments, they had to all go through private borrowers who charged whatever interest those private borrowers wanted. Tax burden fell largely on the poorest classes, members of the Third Estate. Right? So the great wealth that the church possessed and the great wealth that the aristocracy possessed is not part of the tax revenue at all. And so the French government even has a difficult time harnessing its ability to actually adequately determine what the French nation is worth, and taxing it and generating enough revenue to fund its annual budget as well as pay down its own debts. So this is a terrible, terrible economic budgeting and debt crisis. Other immediate causes. Merchants were were increasingly displeased with the state-run mercantilist economy. The government saying who could have a monopoly on certain trade. The government dictating what industries were worth investing in. The government dictating where the colonies should be established and the extraction of what kinds of resources. All of these things were limits on the increasingly entrepreneurial spirit of the merchant class. Other economic causes include rising inflation between 1730 and 1780. Right? While wages only rose 22%, prices for consumer goods rose 65%. And this was in large part because as the French economy as the French population grows, they begin to push at the limit of available food supply. The law of supply and demand kicks in as the food supply and demand come very close together. The prices of food are going to steadily rise, and that's going to cause an inflationary cycle throughout the rest of the economy. Price of bread soars. The 1770s and 80s, this is compounded because there are a series of harsh winters and poor harvests that push the price of bread even higher. That a loaf of bread by the mid-1780s costs the average worker's 1 month's salary. An incredible amount of inflation just for food. And this leaves the poorest classes particularly the poorest among the urbanites, very, very angry, very tired, very burdened, and hungry. That is never a good combination for any regime to have to endure that kind of unpopularity. So, how are these issues um, dealt with by the French government? Well, Louis XVI needs to raise taxes to deal with the financial crisis. That's pretty simple. What he doesn't want to do, however, is he does not want to call the Estates General together, because that's the traditional mechanism of where by which the king has to negotiate with the other major stakeholders in the French government, and he doesn't want to have to do that. The estates had not met for something like 170 years or so, not since the 18 teens, 20s. Excuse me, 16 teens or 20s. Under the reign of Louis XIII, had the estates met. And that was only the second meeting ever of the Estates General. The first meeting in the 14th century was the only other prior time. So since the early 14th century, the Estates General had only met twice. This is not something a French monarch wants to have to deal with. So some of his ministers suggest that he sort of go around this and call for an informal group of notable statesmen who could give cover to the monarch, essentially. People who could basically sign on the dotted line and say, yes, we think this is a good idea. This would deflect criticism away from the king, and these notable people would actually end up taking the fall for it. And eventually the notables saw this deal for what it was. This is in some ways like in the early part of the 20th century, or 21st century, in the U.S. government, when the constitutional mechanism of the House and Senate passing legislation in the 2000s and leading up to 2010 or so, passing legislation in both houses of Congress and then going to a reconciliation committee and hammering out a single bill, and then that bill going back to the House of Congress, and all these votes taking place. Nobody wanted to deal with that, so they just got these sort of super committees together. They hammered out a piece of legislation and then forced it down the throats of both houses of Congress, kind of circumventing the way in which the U.S. Constitution is supposed to work. Sometimes they called them the Gang of Eight, or the Gang of Six, or the Gang of 12. These groups of senators and congressmen that would come together to circumvent the traditional constitutional principle on how bills are passed. Well, that's essentially what the French government's doing at this time. They're trying to circumvent the only mechanism of passing new tax legislation. They did not want to have to deal, these notables did not want to have to deal with the repercussions. And many of them, being aristocrats, want to force the Estates General into coming into power because they were nobles and they wanted an official meeting by which they could exact concessions out of the monarch. And so they're not going to agree to anything here. So, Louis XIV decrees the new tax on his own, without the Assembly of Notables. The Paris Parlement, which we talked about in an earlier lecture, the Paris Parlement blocks the move, says, no, the king cannot do this. The Paris Parlement hopes. Now, the Paris Parlement cannot pass its own legislation. It's only a judicial court. It can only rule on whether a king's move is legal or not. It rules that it is illegal. And they hope that the king will be forced to call the Estates General, thus ending in a power sharing with the nobles. Remember, the people who are on the Paris Parlement are also members of the nobility. So, in the summer of 1788, under the advice of one of his chief ministers, Jacques Necker, Louis XVI, reluctantly calls a meeting of the Estates General for the following spring. So he's going to do it. And he's going to require the delegates carefully study the issue and bring recommendations to a meeting at Versailles, the estate of the French monarchy outside of Paris. So, um, the estates were elected by regional assemblies. Um, so regional assemblies met. They were chosen by the local, sort of by the local populace. They then elected among themselves delegates, and then those delegates went to sit at Versailles. They bring with them the list of grievances. Among those list of grievances are that France should have a constitution, that liberties should be guaranteed by law, that the clergy should be improved, that there should be the abolition of internal trade barriers, that protections should be made for the local peasants, their erosion of their feudal dues, and so forth. So there's each department of France, each region of France, has these lists of grievances that they bring with them, and they are then going to be voiced in the assembly hall. Now, the final issue with the lead up to the revolution and the actual meeting of the estates is the voting in the estates. It had been since 1614, virtually everyone had forgotten how the Estates General voted, couldn't remember, so the Parliament tried to determine this. Finance Minister Necker, who was very popular um, among the lower orders, he said that what we should do is take the third estate and actually be able to double their representatives in the third estate. So that instead of maybe 500 representatives of each estate, the third estate would get 1,000. The Paris Parlement, though, ruled that each estate would caucus and cast a single vote for that estate. So there would only be 3 votes cast. The first estate would cast 1 vote. The second estate would have 1 vote. The third estate would have 1 vote. So even though the representation in the third estate was twice that of the other 2 respective estates, it still only had 1/3 of the total vote share in the estates, which could be argued that an estate that represents 95% of the population only has 1/3 of the political power is inherently inequitable. The problem with that, these two forces, these first 2 bullet points coming together, is that you've limited the power of the third estate, but you've doubled the number of people who can come and complain about the government and still be shut out of the government. So really, these 2 factors are absolutely disastrous for the government. Why you would want to have that many people come and complain about the government and only have 1/3 of the voice in that government is beyond me, but it was an attempt to appease them. It only incensed the members of the third estate more. The Parlement in Paris thought that by organizing the vote, by ruling that the vote take place by estate and not by individual, that this would lead to the dominance of the first and second estates and would lead to that the church would ally with the nobility, and this would lead to the aristocratic resurgence that the nobles and the parlements wanted. The members of the third estate, on the other hand, were furious, and all the meetings soon deadlocked. As a matter of fact, as we will see in a later lecture, there is much more commonality between the members of the third estate and the lesser nobles and the lesser clergy. And so really what ends up happening is those first 2 estates do not behave as was assumed, triggering an aristocratic revolution against the monarchy, turning back the clocks to an earlier time when the king shared power with his nobles. Instead, it will lead to a liberal revolution that will eventually create a constitutional monarchy and eventually a republic. But that is looking ahead a little too far. Until then, thank you for listening.